I think one of the main ways to be able to access your intuition is to have that understanding that, what you're eating, what you're taking in every day, whether it's not just in the form of food, but sensory stimulation, the people you're interacting with, the books you're reading, all of that makes a difference to how you're processing information.
Welcome to Intuition Unlocked, the podcast empowering empathic women who feel misunderstood, overwhelmed, or disconnected from their intuition, begin to trust their sensitivities, find inner clarity, and show up with embodied, unstoppable confidence in their daily lives. I am your host, Olivia Ashley, an empath and intuitive, and I am so happy you're here. Hello, and welcome to Intuition Unlocked. I'm so happy you're here for today's episode because we're diving into a conversation that feels especially supportive for anyone who's been feeling overwhelmed or emotionally depleted and searching for ways to get back in tune with yourself in the seasons of life. My guest today is Radhika, an integrative wellness coach, teacher, and guide who has spent over a decade supporting women executives, creatives, and entrepreneurs in navigating anxiety, self-doubt, and burnout through embodied trauma-informed practices. Her work beautifully weaves together Ayurveda, yoga philosophy, and nutrition, and she's currently preparing to release her first book next year, Radiant Rituals, with Shambhala and Penguin Random House, which is so exciting. So we use that as a launch point for our conversation to explore how ancient wisdom and modern science come together to help women cultivate emotional steadiness, inner confidence, and intuitive clarity. So in this episode, you will learn more about what Ayurveda can teach you, how cyclical living supports your emotional well-being, and why rituals can be powerful anchors during seasons of transition and identity shifts. So take a breath, settle in, and enjoy this nourishing conversation. Well, welcome, Radhika, to Intuition Unlocked. I'm honored to have you here with me and really look forward to this conversation as your work sits at such a powerful intersection of multiple traditions and teachings, including Ayurveda, yoga philosophy, and nutrition. And I'd love to start by having you share the story of how you came to this path and what really drew you specifically to these systems of healing.
That's a great question. And thank you, Olivia, for having me. I really appreciate having this conversation with you. So, to answer your question, what drew me to this, it wasn't something that I went to college and decided this is what I'm going to be doing. As with things like these, like when you realize this is your deeper purpose, they come through sort of a turning point so often in life. And that happened with me as well. My mom got diagnosed, unfortunately, with cancer. And I had this calling, source, wisdom, or whatever, the inner voice telling me to go to the bookstore and get all the books that would help me educate myself on how I can support her chemo through, alternative healing modalities. And so I started studying about that. And then what happened was, as a result of that, long story short, I eventually lost her over a period of time. But I went back to my roots to recover from the grief. We had a very close relationship. And so I went to yoga studios. I lived in Austin, Texas that time. Right now, I'm living in Colorado. And I would go there like twice a day to help me process the grief and move the emotions through my body. And I realized that impacted me in a very healing manner. And so I decided to go back and, become a certified yoga teacher trainer. And then while I was finishing my 200-hour training, I decided I want to go back and study nutrition and, all these alternative therapies that I had learned about while, educating myself. So I went and got myself certified in, health coaching, did various nutrition programs, and through that, I birthed my coaching business at that point. I started working primarily with women, and they were the kind who were already like high performing, but they needed a place, a person to help them either uncover what was going on, not helping them staying in a place of balance, whether it came to their health and nutrition, and also like the other areas of their life, the mental, emotional, spiritual pieces of healing. And so through my own path, I realized, and more recently when I was writing my book, that a lot of what I'm studying and what I've studied has come from ancient wisdom. Specifically, I would say when I did the yoga training, I realized that the philosophy is 99% and the practice piece is 1%. So just going back to using the wisdom from the philosophy and also the ancient healing science from India, which is the sister science of yoga, is Ayurveda. So, like, while I was delving into things like biohacking and, health coaching, I realized a lot of that wisdom was coming from Ayurveda, which is to say that everyone is so unique in their biology that not what is good for you would necessarily be good for me. And so, this simple principles like that help me sort of center down to my roots and incorporate that in my coaching philosophy along with, the other pieces that I gained over the years. But I also realized that I grew up with this wisdom very unconsciously. It was like an embodied lifestyle. The philosophy was ingrained in the way we showed up with each other, and also like when it came to rituals and food and routines and just following the rhythms, it was all very naturally in my lifestyle. But it's only later on that I realized that, oh, I grew up with this, and I started incorporating it in my work and most recently in my book.
That's beautiful. What a hard journey, but to take you to somewhere that feels very purposeful and purpose-led. And I'd like to expand on that a little bit more of what you're saying that you grew up with this. This was already something that is in your lifestyle. And have you start by sharing with my listeners a little bit more about Ayurveda? Because I think we know yoga, we know some of these other practices, but it's not something that we in the Western societies hear often. And or maybe some people might see it as just a wellness trend, but there's so much deep, like you said, philosophy, wisdom. It's been around for so, so long. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective more about what it is and what it can teach us about who we are and how we can apply it. I know that's a huge question, but from a high level, whatever you can share.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. I think what I would say is that I use Ayurveda as a lens, not really in terms of the pharmacological way, in terms of, prescribing herbs and the medicinal way, but using it, it's basically translates directly into science of life. And so we're learning, we have wisdom to learn from nature, the seasons, like cyclical living, so it's very simply translated by just following what's happening in nature. So it's not just about our constitution, but it's also like really understanding the connection between the physical, emotional, and environmental, like how everything is connected. So it doesn't just teach us that, digestion is at the core of keeping all our body systems balanced, but also it's not just what we eat, but it's also what we digest in terms of emotions, relationships, transitions, seasonal changes, and how we move through that. And that's how when we stay in balance, we can then stay in a state of homeostasis. And so it builds in these rituals, like morning rituals and night rituals based on the time of the day. Like when you wake up, this is the intensity, this is the flavor of the morning hour. So, what is it that you do in the morning? When is the time of the day where, for example, afternoon, when the sun is at the highest, is when you have your heaviest meal because there is a fire in your digestion, just like the sun has the fire, which helps you digest your food and metabolize the nutrients. And so, if you have your heaviest meal in the afternoon, that's going to help you stay balanced. So, things like that, which translate from the nature. And then there are three main principles that I like to share, which Ayurveda talks about. Is that the first one is that like increases like. So, whatever is happening in nature, let's say it's cold. And if you start consuming more cold foods, you will feel colder. So what do you do with that? You counterbalance. That's the second principle, that opposites counterbalance. So when it's cold outside, you then automatically, incorporate hot drinks, hot teas, broths, soups, have more grounding foods. If outside is like feeling a little airy and dry, what do you do to balance it? You counterbalance. And similarly, going back to the first principle, like increases like, it also means that let's say that you are taking in some music or a certain kind of book or a certain kind of relationship. Is it adding to you or it's taking away from you? Is it making you expand or contract? And so if it is expanding you, then you increase it because that will amplify that energy. So just using these simple principles that Ayurveda teaches us, you can just apply it to any part of your life. And it's so simple to just help you come back. And then the third one is what happens in the microcosm is affected in the macrocosm and vice versa. So if something's happening, of course, like seasonal changes are affecting us at the micro level, our digestion, our hormones, everything gets affected, but also anything happening environmentally. Let's say there is some, I don't want to talk about politics, but people say like, I don't want to talk about politics, but everything is political. Like if you're living in a collective, you're getting affected, whether there is like people dying in some other part of the country or the world, you are also getting affected energetically. So the macro affects the micro. So what is it that you can do? When Ayurveda teaches us to live a certain way, we are not just doing that for ourselves, but we are also doing it so that it can affect the collective consciousness in a positive way. So those are some three simple principles which I think just distill the main wisdom.
Absolutely. Those were incredibly helpful. And I think I want to talk about the cyclical living a little bit more, the honoring the nature, the seasons, and those inner rhythms. It's not something we're taught from a young age, at least in our culture for the most part, sadly. And I'd love to hear more really what can this start to look like? How, if this isn't something we typically do or have a relationship with, I feel like if you're listening, you probably do to an extent, but any tips or ways that we can really bring this into the day-to-day life?
Yeah, so like I said, food is one way, obviously, when you go out and shop for food. I live in a cold climate, so there's not much growing seasonally right now. But in general, like if you go to the farmer's market or even if you look in your grocery store, what is growing locally in the season right now? So eating seasonally can really help you get in tune with the rhythm of the season, and that will again help with your digestion, your hormones. So like right now when it's fall and winter, we're transitioning into winter everywhere, you want to like have more grounding vegetables, so the root vegetables. And then like in spring it's more like the leafy, the bitter leafy greens, because there is this element of detoxification as we are transitioning from spring, the energy from winter to spring. So just like keeping those little nuances in mind, like what are you eating? So like don't want to have like cold foods, like I said, like ice smoothies, and you don't want to have ice water. I feel like when I have always like to mention, like there's one thing if you take away from this conversation is that stop having ice water, because that is the way that we kill our digestive fire. Because Ayurveda also reinforces that when we evolved as human beings, our digestion evolved. It's meant to be warm and moist. Inside our digestive tract is warm and moist, and for our digestion to be optimal. And I like to talk about digestion because it affects every other system in our body, including you talk about intuition, including our intuition, right? We can't access our intuition if our gut is not optimized. So having ice water does the opposite, right? So like have more warm drinks, not just in winter, but throughout the day, so you can create that warm and moist environment in your digestive tract. Coming back a little more to the cyclical living, right now, again, we are in winter, and the winter tells us the leaves, the trees are all hibernating. That is the energy of the season. We also need to sit by the fireplace with a warm cup of tea and read a book. But also, we have Christmas and we have all these holidays and family and buying presents. And it's like, how do we balance that? Because the energy of the season is actually to slow down. So like less is more, right? I mean, I'm sure you understand that, but it's we are sort of like in a tricky place, because what happens is if we don't follow the rhythm of the season and we are like, okay, we're going to go to this party and we're going to host this and we're going to do this because it's holiday time, then you will feel depleted at the end of the season. So that is what cyclical living tells us, to just follow what's like, it's not so hard, just follow what's the season is telling you and try and live in alignment with that. That is just a very simple way. Of course, there's so much more to it. Like I have a
Mhm.
seasonal living course, and in that course, I go into each season. What is it that you can eat? What are the rituals you do for your hormones? What do you do, like morning rituals, night rituals? So there is a whole sort of guidebook based on the seasons, that you're going through, whether it's fall, winter, spring.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you for explaining that. And I'm curious, because so much of what we focus on, and I think what we tend to through these practices, it's a lot of body. It's a lot of, right, how we eat, the rituals we do, how we take care of ourselves. And I'm curious if you can expand on how, when you work with those rhythms, it supports the emotional well being, the mental well being, even the spiritual well being that is really what we're looking for. How and why is the body the gateway to that?
Yeah, so that's what happens when our digestion is optimal, right? Then we don't have that stuck energy. Our cortisol levels are balanced. When we wake up in the morning, we have a bowel movement, and that just like creates more clarity. And when it creates more clarity, we are able to even digest our emotions well. So it's not like, I'm going to a therapist and I'm going to do meditation and I'm fine. But if you're taking in foods that are processed and you're not eating seasonally, you're not really going to feel the impact for the long term. So, for emotional and spiritual well being, to have those moments of clarity and awakening and consciousness, it's so important that what do you do the moment you wake up in the morning? Not just what you eat, but what are the practices? Do you have a meditation, prayer, gratitude practice? How are you taking care of your body, like oiling your body and, like that's just part of the self-care routine in Ayurveda, where you oil yourself to open up your joints, and also it's an act of self-care, and you're moisturizing your skin. But all those things then open up the channels. Like in yoga, we talk about having these nadis, which are channels around your energy centers, which can get blocked, and therefore you feel the blocks in emotional processing. But when you take care with these grounding rituals, by taking care of your body, what you're doing the moment you wake up, how you go to sleep at the right time, again, following certain rituals, then you see that you're able to regulate your emotions, and your sensory regulation and processing also then becomes a little more clear.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into talking about the book that you are writing, which is called Radiant Rituals, that will be coming out with Shambhala and Penguin House in 2026, I believe you said,
Yes,
correct?
around this time next year. That's
That's
right.
amazing. So exciting. Congrats on that opportunity. And so I would love to talk about how you see the role of ritual in our lives being, and why do you think rituals can support us through these seasons, through our day to day? I'd love just to hear more about it.
Yeah, so I like to like just make the distinction between habits and ritual, because as how I see habits, they're more outcome based. Sometimes a little more, they could be conscious, but sometimes they're a little more unconscious because you read a book and you're like, this is my morning habit I want to, incorporate. But what happens is that sometimes with that is that we don't have a personalized intention around it. We're just doing it because we read in a book or we heard in a podcast. But rituals, I encourage people through my book, which goes through like physical rituals, which is around, your eating. Obviously, your physical health goes around mental rituals, which are more around and mental and emotional rituals, which are things like how do you step into your power, accessing your intuition, from the connection between the gut health and intuition, the power of surrender and letting go, and mental wellness through meditation and mindfulness. And then energetic rituals, I also again talk about intuitive consciousness and breath work and energy management, and how do you activate your life force. So all these rituals can help someone, and either I'm just sharing a little bit about my book, can help anyone, any woman specifically. I write with the woman in mind, but of course men can read it, going through any transitions in life. So coming back to how I feel rituals are different from habits, is that ritual has this feeling of presence, because it's like, in this moment, what do I need? How can I create a morning ritual around my needs and desires, rather than just following this habit? And so I feel like ritual has this element of like sacredness, or almost like a devotion to it. It's not something that you have this like a rigidity around it. It's more fluid, because what happens, especially with the clients that I work with, and me myself, you as well, you're a busy mom. When you wake up in the morning, let's say you have a meditation practice, but it doesn't happen at that time because you have to be tending to your child or something. But you can always come back to that ritual at another time in the day. So there is no like rigidity. You create it based on your season, your day, your desire at that point. And so it could be anything, like I said, I have in my book, could be around eating, it could be on mental, emotional, energy. You can have rituals around all of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And since we are here on Intuition Unlocked, I know that you said one of your book chapters is dedicated to intuition. So, how do you view intuition and what role do those rituals play? And can you give some examples maybe of how we can use them or activate them to help us with our intuition and support us in that manner?
Yeah, again, like I said, I go back to the gut health. I think I always say that eating anti-inflammatory foods and taking care of your gut health will be one of the number one ways to access the intuition. Because if your gut is not optimized, you are going to struggle with accessing the intuition because you're connected through the vagus nerve, which starts at the base of your spine and goes through your gut and the back of your spine. And so when you have the vagus nerve balanced, right, you're in a state of calm and peace and presence. And when you're in that state, you're easier able to process what is happening. You're able to stay in a place of presence and coherence, and you're not acting from external stimulation, but you're acting from the internal place, your inner access of, inner wisdom. So I think one of the main ways to be able to access your intuition is to have that understanding that, what you're eating, what you're taking in every day, whether it's not just in the form of food, but sensory stimulation, the people you're interacting with, the books you're reading, all of that makes a difference to how you're processing information. And the more you get sort of clear with that understanding that it's related to your body, your gut health, then you kind of make those choices based on is this in alignment with how I want to feel? Like even like having a glass of wine once in a while can create more inflammation and take you away from that place of homeostasis. So I think that is one place I really reinstate that, like taking care of your health, your gut health and your digestion, but also like having practices like slowing down, meditation, understanding that when you're making a choice or decision in life, what happens when you access the intuition, especially if you're feeling a little bit like, is this me just getting like cold feet, or is this actually my intuition? Like, how do you differentiate between that? The only way one can differentiate if one is coming from a place of peace and presence rather than like, oh my God, like you're already stimulated. So noticing that what is your emotional state? Like, are you doing it from an internal state or from an external state? Like, is it coming from a place which is somewhere inside or it's coming from external validation? So those are some of the nuances that I share. And then it's also like having this constant state because you're not always like working with a coach or a mentor, but constantly like having inquiries to yourself. When was the last time I felt like in alignment? There is this feeling of peace, whereas there is this feeling of heaviness if you're not making that choice from a place of, that intuition or the. So just recalibrating every time you are making a choice and how do you feel inside. And if you feel light and you feel heavy, then you make a distinction that this is happening from a place of stress, or this is anxiety, or this is intuition. And then of course you strengthen it more by making these decisions, right?
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes me start to think about what also can help is being embodied, really understanding what that looks like and feels like when you're in your body. And both from the perspective, like truly feeling in your body, but also moving that understanding of intuition, of who you are, those things from that mental state into that feeling state. And so I know that Ayurveda and yoga philosophy both emphasize embodiment in different ways of really inhabiting ourselves. And I want to see if you can speak to that a little bit and its relevancy to creating a life where we can feel more present, connect to our intuition, and be more confident as well.
That's a great question. I think for embodiment, I also want to mention like some of the ways, intuition sometimes gets blocked is we're connected, right, all the time on the phone, on the computer, our emails. And so just understanding that when we are living from a place of reactivity versus from a place of conscious and slowness, that can also block when we're, constantly like having this stimulation. So unconscious living and taking actions and choices from there. And the reason why I'm sharing this when you ask me about embodiment, because then we kind of move away. Like embodiment is the antidote to sort of staying blocked in your body and making these decisions and choices from just cognitively. It's important to use your mind as well, intellectual consciousness for making decisions. But if your intuition is blocked all the time and you're not able to access it, or even if you are able to access it, but you're just going with your mind, you're not embodying that lifestyle which will harness your choices from a place of, your beliefs, your values. You're going from this almost like unconscious place where you're over functioning, your boundaries are eroded. How I see embodiment is also that, it's about developing this interoceptive awareness where you can actually sense the internal states. Like, is there tension? Like, when I make this choice, like, am I feeling something like in my stomach, or is my heart feeling heavy? So that is like how you develop that connection with, embodying the interoceptive awareness. Like, why am I craving sugar right now? Or why am I feeling on the opposite side? I'm feeling very much at ease. So just recognizing what's happening. I'm feeling emotionally triggered. I feel like crying, but now I'm feeling peaceful. So what is it that's leading to those states? So that is what the ancient wisdom, talk about embodiment. That is what it feels like. And I think a lot of time I've seen in my clients that they tend to override this because, like I said, they're just living each day unconsciously to get from, and part of it is capitalism or corporate culture, but they're just moving from one activity to the other and then over functioning. And then, okay, now I have to go back and be a mom. So it's sometimes because of these expectations of productivity, we override those, signals. And that's why coming back to the information and, reconnecting with what is your body telling you, that will then make you feel a little more in control, feel more like sovereign about the choices you're making.
I think that's where I want to talk a little bit more about. So, how do we start to shift? So, we're going to live in this modern day. We can understand and see what's happening. Unfortunately, many of us have to go through a very lived experience of moving through the burnout, of moving through the exhaustion, and everything like that. Where do you see that we can start to really recapture our sovereignty if we can't get out of that system fully, or we can't shift away in every aspect? How do we come back to the aspects of rebuilding the foundations that are so important for us to be able to be more robust and resilient and navigate this life in our culture in a way that actually provides that emotional steadiness and the connection to ourselves? I think that's a lot of what we talked about, but I'd love to hear you share more on that.
I think I'll just keep it very simple so it's accessible, that someone who's listening can start maybe, making a change from day one. Is that like when you wake up in the morning, for example, right? Of course, a lot of us has more than one responsibility, but can you find that window of even like 5 minutes or 10 minutes where you just have time for yourself so you can sink in to that place and find out like what is it that I need today for myself. And then when you're drinking your coffee or your water before your coffee, ideally you want to have your water, like a warm glass of water, can you just do that and avoid multitasking? Because then we are like creating those new pathways in our brain where we are like training it to do one thing at a time. So in the morning, can I just have just, if I don't have time to meditate, I'm just gonna drink this warm cup of tea, and it's just gonna take me 5 minutes, but this will give me that sense of mindfulness and slowing down so the rest of my day can have that energy. And at this time, I will also offer gratitude to this water because it was in the clouds and now it's in my cup. And just like slowing down, you slow down your breath and you recalibrate your nervous system, and then you're ready to move on to the next thing. So sometimes it's as simple as that. Like, what is it that you're doing for yourself in the morning? And I talk about the morning because that really sets the tone for the day. And even if you don't have time to do all these rituals that Ayurveda teaches us, right from the morning to the night, at least like one small thing, like creating this 5 minutes of you drinking water or a cup of tea with intentional and not multitasking, just doing a singular activity in the morning can help shift.
I love that. And I think that's so important to keep it simple. It is about building, like recapturing the foundation. So if you're burnt out and you're not in a space where you're feeling good, it's like go back to those roots. Where can you start simple to make little shifts that will ultimately create that ripple out. And so I'm curious, as a woman yourself who is focusing on crafting well-being and resilience, especially with everything that you've learned through nutrition, all these practices, what is a practice or a ritual or just something you would offer to us women listening that can help us maintain strength and well-being? Like, what's your go-to thing that you would just offer and blanket offer most women?
I think again it's so customized, so there's not like one thing I would say is like, I would offer everyone. It just depends on the person. But again, I would say like creating like your own morning ritual, whether it's like for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and I can share some practices that I use, and a night ritual. I think if you can start your day and bookend your day with intentional rituals that will help you recalibrate for the day and also then get rested for the night. I think that really is impactful. So, for example, in the morning, like I said, when you wake up, making sure that you have some time for gazing at the sun or like just taking in some sunlight, moving your body a little bit. And in Ayurveda, we have some practices which incorporate, taking care of your sensory organs. So, one of them is oil pulling, where you take in some sesame oil or coconut oil and you swish it in your mouth. What that does is it increases the ability for your body to release toxins, because from the night there are some toxins that have taken inhabited in your mouth. So you're taking care of your oral health, but you're also taking care of all the other organs that are related. Like in Ayurveda, they say ama, you're clearing the toxins, so you're creating more efficiency in your sensory perception. So similarly, spraying some rose water in your eyes and cleansing your eyes. During the winter months, there is a practice of oiling the edges of your nostril with some sesame oil again. That again opens up your nasal pathways. Because imagine you're moving around life, because our perception is so important. But imagine if you're moving along outside in the world with like not at 100% efficiency of our eyes, our sight, taking in our senses through our nose, consuming what we are through our oral hygiene is not optimized. That is going to affect and impact our respiratory health. It's going to affect our digestion. So just spending like 5 minutes doing these rituals in the morning can be really impactful. And sometimes it's also my favorite practice is called abhyanga, which is like self massage of oils on your body, which I said earlier as well, that it lubricates your joints, it increases moisturizer, especially when you're living in a dry place like Colorado. So just incorporating one or two of these on a daily basis helps you get that jump start to the day with more clarity and more cognition and more presence, because you're slowing down your nervous system. Similarly, in the night, like massaging your feet with some oil, some magnesium oil, putting on some socks will also, when you massage, you're massaging there are some points in your feet. They're called marma points, which similar to acupressure points, but they activate different channels across your body. And so you're like relaxing your feet in the night and with that practice, and that also helps you transition into a good bedtime. So similarly, like morning, create like a bookend ritual with few practices that help you calm down. And I think having like morning and night rituals can be mostly very impactful for most people.
Yeah, those are great examples. And I like that you frame it in a way too of using your senses because it's really attainable to everyone of checking in and going, how do I tend to this, my sight, my seeing, my feeling, right? All those things, and then have build practices around that. That feels like such a great door opening of sorts to help people start to see like where can they lean in more or where are they already doing a good job at and build those other foundations.
Yeah, exactly.
So, bringing it back a little bit to intuition, how does intuition play a role in the evolution of how we care for ourselves and create more attuned lives?
It just takes away from anxiety. I think what happens is when we are not able to access intuition, there is this sort of like this feeling of heaviness, because we are engaging in life from like a place of validation or what others have told us or what we read or what we think we should be doing, right? And that somewhere creates this sense of overwhelm or this like ruminating thoughts. And sometimes we don't even know why that is happening. And so the antidote of that is to like just drop into your heart and access that wisdom from a place of presence and coherence. That is how it can, shift us just moving out of anxiety and we'll feel steady, we feel grounded. It doesn't keep us in the loop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if you could leave those listening with one truth about honoring their inner rhythm or trusting that intuitive wisdom, what would you want them to remember or take away from this conversation?
I think as women, we think about like health optimization and, what is the next best thing or what is the next diet. I think if we move that into, we shift that into like, how can we regulate ourselves, our nervous system? How can we feel more embodied in our body? How can we shift from a place of overfunctioning and having that guilt from, investing in rest and joy and pleasure? How can we shift into that and create those practices as foundational versus like just this is the next new supplement or this is the next new diet, but like how is this affecting my nervous system? How am I feeling more embodied? How can I invest in joy and pleasure and rest as compared to just like doing the next thing? To like how can I minimize adding in more things but like focus on these foundational things like embodiment, joy, pleasure, rest.
Those things are where the needle shifts. Those things are, I think, the gaps that our society has that we don't put attention on. I think that that's a really good explanation. To close us out, I have one last question for you, which is what has helped you the most in unlocking and deepening your connection with your own intuition?
I think it's the same that I just said, which is like regulating my nervous system. Like when I notice that I am overthinking, I'm in that cycle of like ruminating thoughts, that intrusive thoughts are just coming in and I'm just stuck in that cycle. So that is the opposite of what I want to be if I want to unlock my intuition. So like what can I do? So like slow my breath down, maybe journal, maybe talk to a friend or a coach, regulate my nervous system, move my body. One thing that works for me is also like dancing sometimes to move my energy or just like lifting some weights. And then again, like doing singular instead of like aimlessly scrolling or like, just watching something or consuming some junk food, which is some of the things that people do to soothe themselves. Can I just slow down and do one thing, which is like have a warm cup of tea, maybe like something like an herbal tea, which is like my favorite is tulsi rose because it's like holy basil is a adaptogen which helps us balance stress and calm the mind. So I will make that cup of tea intentionally and I'll sit down. Can I slow down and just drink this cup of tea? And then decide what is it that I need to do. So that just helps me, if I'm feeling blocked in my intuition to unblock it and then clarity comes in. So I would say like leading with what your nervous system needs would be a great way to get there.
That makes sense. Thank you for sharing about that. And well, I think that's everything I have for you. I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to share your insight and your wisdom with me. Will you let my community know where they can find you or what you have going on?
Sure. Thank you again, Olivia. I thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with you. They can find me on Holistic Prana. That's my website. They can also find me Holistic Prana on Instagram, and I offer one-on-one mentoring around, coaching and mentoring for women. And then I also have a seasonal living course, and then of course I have my book that's coming next year around this time. So if they're interested, they can sign up to be on my newsletter and they'll know when the book is out.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing all that information with us. And I'm wishing you all the best with the rest of the season.
Thank you, Olivia. Wishing you the best as well. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on Intuition Unlocked. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of insight, guidance, or intuitive inspiration. To dive deeper into our community and get access to exclusive content, head to my website at www.olivia-ashley.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You can also connect with me on Instagram at wildlyolivia for daily inspiration and updates. Remember, your intuition is your superpower. Trust it, nurture it, and let it guide you. Until next time, I'm Olivia Ashley, and I can't wait to connect with you again.